The purpose of this video is to explain how to do a random walk. A random walk is a systematic technique that's used in survey data collection if there is no reliable list of individuals or households to draw respondents from.
My name is Jessica Hagensanker and I lead the MIGNIX survey.
And I'm Jürgen Karling, leader of the MIGNIX project overall. In MIGNIX, we carry out research in 25 research areas. Each research area is divided into clusters. So here, for instance, we have a map of an imaginary research area divided into clusters. Our colleagues do a sampling of the clusters so that we target a specific number of batches of interviews within each cluster. One batch is 20 interviews. So in this case, we imagine that they've done a sampling and they've concluded that each of these clusters will have either no batch or 1 or 2 or 3 batches, depending on the size of the population in the cluster. Now, the challenge is, how do we select the specific households within each cluster where we conduct the interviews? So here, for instance, in this cluster, we know we'll do one batch of 20 interviews, but which households? So imagine that this is our research area in greater detail. Now, the question is, how do we find the 20 households where we do interviews within this red boundary? Normally, the clusters will be bigger than this, but this map serves as a good example to show the principle of doing a random walk.
The fundamental principle of doing a random walk is to always alternate between turning right and turning left. So when you walk through a research area to sample respondents, you make a route going right, then left, then right, then left, and so on. There are specific rules in terms of how to do these turns in practice, which you'll know by the end of this video. There are 3 important aspects to random walks. First, how do you begin a random walk? Second, how do you make out the route that you follow through the cluster? And then third, how do you count households along the route? When you start your random walk in a new cluster, you'll be given a sampling interval and a side of the street you're sampling on, and we'll come back to those later. Each enumerator will also be allocated a starting point within the cluster. From that point, your first task will be to determine which direction to begin walking in and at which dwelling to conduct your first interview. Then, when you commence your random walk, your next task will be to find out where to turn at the next intersection.
So imagine that this is your starting point underneath this tree. Normally, a tree is a good type of starting point because it's a specific point where you can start to walk. But then you see in front of the tree there's a row of houses, and you could follow it either in the one direction or in the other direction. So we need a system to know which direction to follow. And to do that, we always go into the field prepared, carrying a clipboard and a pen, and we spin the pen on top of the clipboard to determine the initial direction. So now we'll talk about a few different types of starting points and what to do in different situations. So here the starting point is right at the cluster boundary, along a road that crosses the boundary and takes us into the cluster. So it's obvious that the only way to start the random walk from here is to follow that road leading into the cluster. But after a while, we reach an intersection, and that's where we'll have to spin the pen in order to know how to proceed. So once we get there, we spin the pen, and in this case, it shows us that we should turn to the right and follow that road. Here's another type of situation where there is not only a road leading into the cluster, but there's also a road going along the cluster boundary. So from this starting point, there are 3 different possibilities for where we should start walking. So here we have to spin the pen at the starting point. It shows that we should start walking into the cluster, and after a while we reach an intersection. Since we haven't made any turn yet, we don't know whether to make a right or a left at that intersection. So we'll have to spin the pen to make our first turn. Spin the pen, it tells us to turn left. So from there on, we know that the next one will be a right, and then the next one after that will be a left, and so on. Now imagine that at the starting point, we spin the pen, and it shows us that we should walk along the cluster boundary. So we do that, and we reach an intersection. Here's another important rule. Whenever we walk along the cluster boundary, and we reach a street that takes us into the cluster, away from the boundary, we follow that street. So that's what we do here, and that will be our first turn. It's a right turn, and that means that at the next intersection, we now will make a left turn. Here's yet another type of situation where the starting point is in the middle of the cluster, and there are 5 different possibilities for where to start walking. So we spin the pen, and it shows us one of those directions. We follow that direction, and we reach the boundary. So now, when we reach the boundary, we know that we'll have to turn either right or left, but we'll have to spin the pen to know which one it should be. So here it tells us to turn to the left. And that means we'll start walking along the cluster boundary. And then when we get to that intersection, we follow the rule that I mentioned, that after having walked along the boundary and reaching a road or a street that takes us into the cluster, away from the boundary, then we follow that street. So then we make a left turn, and when we reach the intersection that happens to also be our starting point, we turn to the right. It doesn't matter that you cross streets that you've already passed, or that you reach points where you've already been. A random walk is random in the sense that it also makes twists and turns like that. Now, if this last intersection hadn't been at the boundary, then we would have had different options for where to go, and we would have known that since we just made a turn to the left the last time we spun the pen, we'll have to make a turn to the right. So this is our example cluster again. We spun the pen at the starting point. It showed us that we should walk along the row of houses as shown on the map here, and then we reached the first intersection. And here we can follow the rule saying that after having walked along the boundary, when we reach a possibility to move away from the boundary into the cluster, we follow that route. So here, in this case, we'll make a turn to the left. So now we reach the logic of the route itself. As we mentioned, the basic logic is to alternate between turning right, turning left, turning right, turning left, and so on. Doing that in practice means that you have to stay attentive to the previous turn. Always remember whether your last turn was to the left or to the right. You also have to be very attentive to every intersection, every possibility for making a choice about whether to walk straight or to the left or to the right. You have to stop and think, where should I walk now? A last point here is that left and right isn't always literally to the left and to the right. It's the leftmost and the rightmost of the options available. We'll show you what that means.
So here we are in our example cluster again. We've made the left turn at the beginning, following the rule that when you walk alongside the boundary, you take the first turn away from the boundary. And since that was a left turn, we know that the next turn should be to the right. Our next turn is a left turn again. This one's a tricky one and is a good example of the importance of staying alert when doing a random walk. At first sight, it looks like the street here only bends to the left, but there's actually a small turn off to the right, so here we turn leftmost. The next intersection is more obvious again. Here we turn right again. We follow this logic in the same way throughout our walk, alternating between left and right. In this last instance here, you saw that we had to do a right turn, but in this instance, it actually means going straight ahead. We had 2 options to turn at this intersection, and doing a right turn is actually the rightmost turn. If you're unsure in situations like this, stand in the middle of the intersection, as it makes it easier to determine what's a left turn and a right turn, but of course only if there are no cars. Thereafter, we turn left, then we turn right, and here we've reached the cluster boundary again and are walking alongside it. So that means we need to take the first turn away from the boundary, even if that means another right turn here. Thereafter, we just keep following the same rule. It's really important that you always keep track of what you did for your last turn. You might even want to write it down. Here you see that we made a right turn, and thereafter the street itself makes a sharp turn to the left. That doesn't matter, it's only the turns that you take at intersections that determine your direction. How the road itself bends doesn't matter. And you keep going in this way until you've reached the end of your random walk. The end of your random walk is determined by the number of interviews you've completed. Your fieldwork supervisor will tell you when to stop. Two more things to keep in mind. Sometimes you might meet another enumerator and your random walks might even cross. That doesn't matter. You should only never interview the same household. If you take a break while conducting your random walk, you should always note down where you stopped, which household you last counted, and what your last turn was. When you come back, you will commence your random walk exactly where you left it off. As we've already mentioned, intersections can be tricky, so Jürgen will give you some more examples.
So here, although it looks like just a street going straight ahead, there are actually two intersections. First, there's the possibility to taking off to the right, or you could continue straight ahead, which would then be the leftmost option. And then a little bit further ahead, there's an intersection with a narrow alley taking off to the left, or continuing straight, which would be the rightmost option. So the intersections might not be obvious, but you have to stay attentive to where there is a choice of different directions that you could follow. It doesn't matter if streets are wide or narrow or paved or not. Wherever there is a passageway that people use, you should also regard it as a possible direction that you could follow. So here's an example where you would have to make a judgment. Is this an intersection or not? I would say that it is, because there is the open space to the right of the road, and people do use it to get to their houses or to other streets. So you could see, for instance, are there tracks in the sand that indicate it being used, or are there houses that have their doors onto that open space in the way that we see that some houses do here. So even though the paved road continues only straight ahead, there is an intersection that you have to take into account when you decide on the route for your random walk. Sometimes you also have to consider what makes up one intersection. So in these cases, you see A and B are actually pairs of two intersections, while C and D are single intersections. The point is that an intersection is where several roads come together in a single point, and that is not the case in A and B. So here you would have to stop and think twice at each of the two intersections in A and each of the two intersections in B about which turns you should be making. Whenever you reach an intersection like this one with two roads crossing, the only thing that's certain is that you're not going straight ahead, because you will always be making a turn either to the left or to the right. As we mentioned, going to the right is not always literally to the right, and likewise, left is not always literally to the left. Rather, we're talking about the rightmost option and the leftmost option. So imagine that after having made a turn to the left, we get to this point where we'll have to make a turn to the right. And the rightmost option here is to go straight. At the next intersection, we should keep left, which means, again, going straight. Here we make a turn to the right, and it's a regular turn, straight right. At the next intersection, we turn left, and then again, we pay attention to following the leftmost option, which is not the street going straight left, but slightly backwards left. And here we make a right turn, which is actually slightly to the left, because that's the rightmost of the two options we have. Here's an example of a street that makes a sharp turn to the left. But as we mentioned, how the street itself turns doesn't matter. It's only the turns that you make at an intersection with several options.
At times, your random walk takes you to the cluster boundary, so that's the case here. You've made a turn to the right and you've reached the cluster boundary. And if you were to continue, you would leave the cluster, which you can't do. So you have to turn around at the boundary, and since your last turn was to the right, you count that turnaround as a turn to the left. And then at the next intersection, you turn to the right. You follow the same principle if you reach a dead end, so at the end of a road where you would have to turn around. Now, imagine that at this cluster boundary, there was also a road going alongside the boundary. So here you would be following the general left-right rule. And having made right turn before, you turn left when reaching the boundary and follow the boundary. Here's a third example where you reach the boundary and you start walking alongside it. So not bumping into the boundary, but walking alongside it initially. Then, as we've mentioned already, whenever you reach a boundary and start walking alongside it, as soon as there's a turnoff back inside the cluster, you take it. So that happens here at the next intersection. Even though your last turn was to the right, you turn right again to get away from the cluster boundary. So now you've learned how to determine the route of a random walk. Now you'll learn how to count the houses alongside the route in order to find out which ones should be approached to be interviewed. There are a few important principles here. First, each enumerator is only allocated one side of the road. So each enumerator counts only on the left-hand side or only on the right-hand side. Second, there's a specific gap between the households that you approach called the sampling interval. This can vary from cluster to cluster. So for example, if the sampling interval is 4, it means you count 1, 2, 3, 4 households before knocking on the door of the 4th household to approach them for an interview. Once you're done, you will count 4 households again to reach your next household. There are also a few other rules which we'll cover in detail later on.
So imagine that you're about to start the random walk. Now the first house that you approach is the first eligible house on your side of the street. So here, right next to the starting point, assuming that you're counting on the left, there is a house where someone lives, so you knock on the door and seek to do an interview. After having visited that house, you go out onto the street and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then get to the next house where you knock on the door and ask to do an interview, because in this case, the sampling interval is 4. Always, after having knocked on a door, you start counting again with 1. So regardless of whether nobody was at home or the person refused to be interviewed or you did an interview, once you leave that house, you start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, if 4 is the sampling interval, before you knock on the next door.
The first important rule in counting is to only include houses where someone lives. Sometimes that isn't obvious. So for example, with a shop, you might be inclined to think that it's not a residential building, but the shopkeeper may actually live there with his family. It could be a house under construction, but someone's already living in the unfinished house, or it could be a nice looking finished house, but it's actually empty and only rented out during the holiday season. The second rule is that you should only include houses that have their front door facing the route. So for instance, we previously showed you a photo of back alleys, stressing that it's important to follow back alleys as part of your route. But if there are only back doors in this alley, you shouldn't count any houses while walking there.
Here's an example of counting with a sampling interval of 4. And it shows some examples of which houses to include and to exclude along the route. So first we see that house B should not be included because their front door, is not directly facing the route, since we're turning to the left in that intersection. Then we should also not count house C because we're only walking along the side of that house, so even if there is a small side door, the main door is not facing the route. Finally, we should exclude house A, and that's because we should assume that we're walking along the middle of the road and then making a turn, and then house A doesn't actually have a door that faces directly to our route. The one next to it, which has the count 2, does have a front door facing the route, so we should include that one, but not A. So think of this middle of the road principle to decide which houses to include and exclude in cases like this one. This illustration is also in the enumerator's guide, and it's a good example to test yourself and consider which of these 6 doors should I be knocking on if I'm counting on the left and turning to the left, counting on the left and turning to the right, counting on the right and turning to the right, and counting on the right and turning to the left. So each of those 4 different scenarios, which of the doors A, B, C, D, E, F should you be knocking on? Test yourself and check the answers in the enumerator guide. The next rule is to count every household in the dwelling. So we're not actually counting houses, we're counting households. And the dwelling here is the building, basically, where there could be either just one household, one family living, or there could be multiple households, like an apartment building with many apartments. So for every building along the route, you have to consider how many families, how many households are there in this building. Sometimes it's obvious from the outside, but often it's not. And then you have to look at details such as the number of doorbells or maybe the number of balconies, and then try to figure out whether someone is also living in the ground floor or whether the ground floor is only used as a commercial space. When it's not possible to see, you might have to ask neighbors or residents or others in the area who would be able to tell you. Here's an illustration of how we do the counting along the route. So we start with house number 1, a regular single household dwelling. Then house number 2 is a bigger house, but we find out that there's only one family living there. So that's number 2. The next house we skip because it's abandoned, nobody lives there. Then we get to an apartment building, and we figure out that there are 8 apartments there. And when we have a multi-household dwelling like this one, we always count in a sequence starting from the left to the right and going up, then going down, and if necessary, going up and down again if there are multiple staircases. So here we count 3, 4, and 5 is our sampling interval, so then we make note of the apartment that is our 5th count, and then we continue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have another apartment in the same building that should be approached. So then we ring the doorbell of the first apartment that we identified, and then afterwards we go to the other apartment that we had identified in that building. And then after reaching the sampling interval of 5 in the apartment building, we proceed out on the street again. We reach a house where there is a shop on the ground floor, but there's an apartment above it. So that's another household. We start again at 1. Then we get to a building which is only a shop, so nobody lives there. And then we get to another multi-household dwelling with 1 family living on each floor. So we count 2, 3, 4. And then 5 is another single household dwelling. So now we've been through how to do a random walk. As you've seen, there are many specific rules that you have to learn and follow for how to start, what to do at intersections, what to do at the cluster boundary, how to count households in buildings with multiple households, and so on. So you have to learn the rules and keep them in mind as you do the random walk. We should also stress again that you have to be very attentive to intersections, that not every intersection is immediately visible as an intersection. But to do the walk correctly, you have to stay attentive and always consider, is this an intersection, and if so, where should I turn? Lastly, There are many cases in which you can't find out everything that you need to know just by looking, and you have to talk to people who live there. That's especially to find out whether somebody lives in a house or if it's empty. And in buildings that might have many families living there, you might have to ask local residents how many families actually live in that building before you can do your count. So we wish you good luck doing your random walks. It will take some practice to get used to, but after a while you will master it.